To wrap up our discussion of focus groups, let's talk about some of the pros and cons of using a focus group. Why might you choose this as your research method? Well, the benefit of a focus group is that it will stimulate new ideas and thoughts by having respondents interact with each other. So if we're doing brainstorming, we could have just as easily done an interview. One-on-one, we talk to people, we ask them the same questions. The difference between an interview and a focus group is that a focus group has the benefit of stimulating new ideas and thoughts by having respondents interact with each other. That is that you can ask questions and a person can respond with the thoughts that are immediately in their head, but when they hear someone else say something, it generates new thoughts in their head and they feed off of each other. So focus groups can give you a much richer amount of feedback because people are hearing the feedback from other people. Okay? There's also an opportunity for your client to observe from behind the glass if you have that set up. So like we saw in the video from the Colbert Report, right, you can see that the client can sit behind that one-way mirror and observe what is happening. And so they can then see that body language and how people are behaving, and they get it firsthand. It's not you reporting back to the client, here's what we heard, here's what we saw. They can get that experience firsthand without it impacting people's responses. Because of course, if you watch people, it changes their behavior. And if it's the person who is invested in this issue watching, then it's even more likely to sway. And if it's kind of like the boss watching the employees and the employees are giving feedback, well, if the employees know the boss is watching, then of course it's going to change what they say and do, since they are trying to, not get on the bad side of the boss kind of thing, right? So there is that richer experience you can get from a focus group if you have the infrastructure to have that behind the glass experience. The other benefit of a focus group is that it can be quicker than other techniques. So if we're doing surveys, we have to wait for people to respond. We have to get all the responses in. We have to do the analysis. One of the things you saw with the focus group is that we had that instant analysis where we had a moderator debriefing right after. And so you already have information and are discussing what information we've collected, what we can do from the information we heard, how is that going to impact the organization? So we can get that response, that analysis right away, which is much faster than many of the other techniques. The downside to focus groups is that if you're doing a focus group, then it tends to decrease the client's willingness for quantitative. So the key here to remember is that focus groups are qualitative research. They're used for exploration. The responses represent the responses from that small group. It isn't necessarily representative of the greater population. The challenge we have, we bring a client in, they sit behind the glass, they watch, and they now have the answers they need and they're ready to act. And that means they're less willing to do quantitative research, less willing to do a survey to see if the responses we got from the focus group really represent the greater group. So that's the risk, is that because you get that instant analysis, they're less willing to find out if that's how the greater group really feels, as opposed to being thorough. And then using that brainstorming, that exploratory analysis, which is the focus group, to inform and create better descriptive analysis or like quantitative approach. So with that, right, the issue here is that the info in the focus group, does not represent, may not represent the population you're trying to get the information from. Okay. It might be difficult, actually it is really difficult, to recruit participants. So when we do this in my face-to-face class, we actually put on really, my goodness, DIF, difficult to recruit participants. So we do this with my face-to-face classes. We'll actually put on a focus group and the students will conduct it themselves and they have to find participants. It's really hard to find 8 to 12 people willing to give you an hour. And so you don't really realize that until you start trying to do it. So one of the downsides, a big downside of focus groups, is it's really hard to find participants. And interesting, I have a fourth point. What was the point? The other piece with your cons is that it is important that your client not be the moderator. So there does need to be some separation between whoever is doing the moderating and who is the one who's looking for the information. In a previous video, I was talking about how difficult it is for me when I moderate internal focus groups to not correct people, to let them talk even if the things are wrong. That is one challenge with those who are intimately involved with the decision and the impact of the information gathered, being the moderator. But the other challenge with being the moderator is that you don't want to influence the responses, right? So for example, let's suppose I was to conduct a focus group with my students about my class. Okay, so I'm going to ask them questions about what is working, what is not working with, let's say, this marketing research course, and I am the one asking the questions. So I'm sitting there asking them questions. Well, I haven't given them any grades yet, so they're probably going to be reluctant to tell me about all the terrible things about the class because they know that the grades, I could, give them a bad grade if they give me bad information, right? That it changes my perception of them. So that's coming back to the research ethics and ensuring that there is that free informed consent, that people are able to give their opinions without coercion, without bias. The challenge is that if you're giving feedback on a product, on a program, on services to the person who actually provides those things, there's a concern that there might be future repercussions if I don't give you the things you want to hear. That if I tell you the truth, you might not provide me with service in the future, or you might give me a bad grade. So as we look at the ethics with focus groups, it is important that that moderator have some distance from what is done with the information that is gained. So you might be the external party they hired to be the moderator to conduct this, or it might be that you are in a different department, a different role within the organization, and you are then doing this as a more impartial third party, even though you're inside the organization, to then inform someone else. So you really want to be clear about any biases that might come in, and that moderator does need to be very careful about how they respond, how they probe, and when they interject into those conversations. So one last discussion here before we end our topic of focus groups is online focus groups. So in the world of Zoom and Teams, we do have online focus groups. They've actually been around longer than Zoom and Teams. So focus groups have been going on for about 20 years, even though most of the world really hasn't done a whole lot of online interactions except for maybe in the last, since kind of COVID. So online focus groups, pros and cons. Why do that versus in person? Well, the benefit of online, of course, is that's cheaper because I don't have to find a place that can host the event. I can actually access hard to reach target populations. One of the challenges with the face-to-face focus groups is what time of day and where do you locate it so that people are willing to show up. We talked about having it attached to a conference, for example, and that's because if your focus group requires people who where there's a small amount of people who have that knowledge, it's hard to get them together. And if they're busy professionals and experts, it's even harder to get them together. So we tend to do things like attached to a medical conference in order to get feedback from doctors. But online, you can also get them to everyone log in at 6 p.m. and then they can participate. So you can get access to people across large geographical areas or harder to reach individuals. So they come from a group. Remember, population is the group of people that you want your sample to come from. The client can observe, just like having that what do we call it? The mirror, that glass, so that they can watch without disrupting the participants. They can be a silent observer when you have it online. They're not really noticed as being present. They're acknowledged because you need informed consent. So make sure that you acknowledge that they are present. But they kind of get forgotten if they aren't shown as a person on the screen inside your teams, and they don't say anything. We do find that with online focus groups, shy participants are more likely to provide feedback. Sometimes your focus groups, you can have them talk verbally, but you can also have them enter things into the chat. And so this might get you to hear from more people. But the challenge is, if you've ever been in a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting, there's a lot of group dynamic that's lost because it's hard to get those nonverbal clues. So people don't quite know when someone's done talking and they want to respond. And it's a little awkward to transition between speakers. And so you lose some of that natural energy where people feed off of each other. The client doesn't get as much firsthand knowledge because it's harder to see those nonverbal clues up on the screen versus in person. And it's also difficult to create that space. Like we talked about the importance of the setting being a quiet space where people can talk. If we do online focus groups, people are often multitasking. They might have other people come into the room. We can't isolate from the external influences. We can't keep them from checking email at the same time. And so that does diminish a bit the richness of the conversation because people aren't completely 100% engaged. And then if you have a moderator trying to probe and pull out information, it can be a bit more limited based on the technology and trying to get people to talk. If you've been in a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting, when they're online, they go a lot faster because people are less likely to chime in. If you're in those meetings where people do chime in, everything takes twice as long. And that's because it's that difficulty switching between and feeding off people. It causes more delays, takes longer. And so your Zoom or your Teams meeting either takes twice as long because you have talkers, or no one talks, and they are much shorter meetings. So there are pros and cons of going online for your focus groups. You get the much richer environment face-to-face, but it can be harder to get participants in a face-to-face environment.